Let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're diving into something that happens entirely inside your own head, but actually has massive implications for how our whole society functions. We're going to unpack some absolutely fascinating research by Dr. T. Philip Madison. He looked at how the hidden cognitive processes of our internal dialogues, literally the voices in our heads, drive our political identities. It's a real journey into the intersection of communication psychology and the voting booth, and honestly, the findings are going to make you rethink every political conversation you've ever had, especially the ones you have when nobody else is around. So let's start with a highly relatable human experience. I want you to think about the last time you rehearsed a comeback or maybe replayed a difficult conversation in your head long after it actually ended. You know the deal. Maybe you were in the shower, driving to work, or just staring at the ceiling at 2 a.m., mentally arguing with your boss, a family member, or some stranger on the internet. We all do it. It's an incredibly common, universal behavior. But here's the thing. These aren't just random daydreams. They're actually the building blocks of how we interact with the world. All right, looking at the academic framework here, these private, internal conversations are what communication psychologists call imagined interactions, or IIs for short. They define it as a form of functional daydreaming, where you construct cognitive scripts. Think of it kind of like a mental flight simulator. You get to test out what you're going to say, predict how the other person might react, and figure out your own feelings before you ever have to open your mouth in the real world. And what's really interesting is that these inner conversations serve highly practical functions in our everyday lives. Researchers have basically categorized them into 6 main functions. You might use them for rehearsal to prepare for a future encounter, or catharsis just to blow off some steam. Maybe you use them for relationship maintenance to feel connected to someone far away, or for self-understanding to figure out exactly where you stand on a tough issue. Point is, we are constantly doing this invisible cognitive labor behind the scenes.
Moving on to Section 1. The politics of inner dialogue. Let's see how this plays out. So what exactly happens when we take these imagined interactions into the voting booth? To bridge that gap, we first need to neutrally define partisanship. Now, in our highly polarized world, we tend to think of partisanship as this set of strict moral beliefs or some deep ideological commitment. But from a cognitive psychology standpoint, it's much simpler than that. Partisanship acts as a convenient schema or heuristic. Basically, it's a built-in mental shortcut. It allows a voter to process massive amounts of complex information really quickly just by relying on their party's established stance.
Which brings us to Section 2, the partisan autopilot.
This leads to a super fascinating question explored in Dr. Madison's research. How do deeply entrenched partisans process new political information compared to everyone else? If partisanship is just a shortcut, what does that mean for the voices in their heads? Well, look at this quote from Dr. James Honeycutt, who is a foundational researcher in this field. He says, just as simple motor acts are often so overlearned that performance is automatic and mindless, social interactions may also become mindless. When a behavior, a social script, or a political stance is overlearned, we shift into this state of mindlessness. We don't have to actively think about tying our shoes, right? And similarly, we might not actively think through every single nuance of a political debate if we already have a prepackaged script ready to go.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is that a staunch partisan doesn't need to spend immense mental energy debating every new issue in their head. Why? Because their party affiliation acts as an automatic mindless filter. When a new controversy drops in the news, a strong partisan, whether they're on the left or the right, already has a framework to evaluate it. They don't need to engage in intense, exhausting internal dialogue to figure out how they feel. They just check the shortcut. They're literally on cognitive autopilot. Now, wait a second. We definitely should note that operating on this mindless autopilot isn't inherently a bad thing, and it's certainly not an insult. As the great journalist Walter Lippmann noted a full century ago, seeing the world in full detail is exhausting. There's just too much information, too many bills, too many crises for any one human brain to process thoroughly from scratch every single time. Cognitive shortcuts are incredibly valuable for survival and just daily functioning. Simply put, autopilot saves fuel. Up next, Section 3. The mindful independent.
But what happens in the brains of voters who do not have this convenient partisan shortcut to fall back on? What happens when you strip away the autopilot? Well, welcome to the complex internal world of the independent voter. Dr. Madison and his colleagues conducted a study to explore exactly this. They wanted to know if people who vote along party lines differ in their imaginative functioning from those who don't. So they surveyed a group of college students, measuring the frequency and functions of their imagined interactions, and then cross-referenced that data directly with their stated voting preferences, Republican, Democrat, or Independent.
And the data reveals a pretty surprising twist. Independent voters actually engage in significantly more internal dialogue in 3 key areas than steadfast partisans do. Specifically, independents scored higher in using their internal monologues for self-understanding, for rehearsal, and for relationship maintenance. When you look at the hard numbers, both Democrats and Republicans consistently fall behind independent voters in self-understanding and rehearsal interactions. Just look at the self-understanding column for a second. Independents are way up at 3.26, while Republicans are at 2.87 and Democrats are down at 2.55. And you can see that the exact same pattern holds for rehearsal and relationship maintenance. The partisans are statistically pretty similar to each other, but the independents really stand out. They are doing substantially more cognitive labor in their own heads.
This juxtaposition right here perfectly cements the core thesis of the research. Because partisans have a built-in shortcut, they operate somewhat mindlessly in the political sphere, whereas independents must actively script their thoughts, making them mindful. Think about it. If an independent voter wants to discuss a political issue with a friend, they can't just rattle off party talking points. They actually have to mentally rehearse the conversation beforehand, figure out where they stand to achieve that self-understanding, and navigate the relationship maintenance to avoid unnecessary conflict.
Bringing us to our final section, Section 4, Rethinking Political Identity.
We so often use terms like flip-flop or wishy-washy for people who don't commit to a party, kind of assuming they just aren't paying attention. But because independents lack that automatic partisan filter, they're constantly doing the heavy lifting of maintaining mindful internal dialogues and engaging actively with new information. Mindfulness, in this academic context at least, implies an active engagement with incoming data, and that often leads to more creative thought and complex internal scripting. So they aren't ignoring the issues, their brains are practically working overtime to process them.
The researchers pose a really fascinating chicken or egg question based on these results. Does picking a party early on give us such strong self-understanding that we just no longer need to have these internal debates? Or, conversely, does relying on a party actually stop us from doing the internal imaginative work necessary to truly understand our own evolving values? It is a profound paradox. Furthermore, this challenges us to critically evaluate how we process the news, asking if our cognitive shortcuts might sometimes override accurate assessments of the political landscape. If we're flying on partisan autopilot, are we actually evaluating a candidate's platform? Or are we just letting our overlearned scripts do the driving, while our conscious mind takes a nap?
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to reflect on. The next time you step into the voting booth, or, the next time you find yourself rehearsing an argument in the shower, ask yourself, is your political reality being guided by a mindless cognitive autopilot, or are you mindfully writing an active inner script? Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and hey, pay attention to those voices in your head.